I'm going to run from 1200 to 1900 in China. And so the starting point here is going to be China as one of the wealthiest societies, most sophisticated societies. And when we get to 1900, then China is going to be on the ropes, or the Boxer Rebellion, things are not going well. And so the problem with ending up in that place, studying this over the course of the year, is that sometimes, since that's the last thing we talked about with China, students can remember China earlier than that period as being weak and unmodernized. And that's very much not the case. For the vast majority of civilized history, China would be at the forefront of those wealthy manufacturing-based societies. So let's go through the 1200 era and look at what's going on at that point. So what we have here is a document written by a figure Han Yu, who seems to have been put on this earth to provide documents for AP students, because he is a leading Confucian scholar, and so therefore is conveying their viewpoint. He's addressing the emperor in an official document, and he's writing in 819 CE. And so the reason that that last part is significant is that it's during this period that there is something of a backlash against Buddhism in China. And so Buddhism had begun to spread to China in the Han period, so pretty close to zero, and had really caught on in the period that followed the Han collapse. And think about Buddhism as a religion that addresses suffering. Lots of people are suffering, and it's going to be a popular religion as a consequence of that. And so Buddhism found many adherents during that time, especially among the lower class Chinese. Now, as we enter the Tang period then, there were several emperors that began to use Buddhism in more of a political way. So from the perspective of the Confucian scholars, the scholars who had passed the exam and were running the bureaucracy, it was one thing for Buddhism to be practiced by peasants. It was another thing for Buddhism to have something of a state influence. And so that is partially where that backlash comes from. And so here we see this Confucian scholar saying that these Buddhist monks and their relic will lead people in the crowd to cut off their arms and mutilate their flesh, and that the Buddha is a man of the barbarians and doesn't conform to our laws. And so this is where we can definitely source this document. It's a very rich document for sourcing, because we can say that as a Confucian scholar, he is exaggerating the mutilation that will take place in order to convince the emperor to oppose Buddhism. And nevertheless, his statements are credible in how they represent the views of Confucian scholars generally in that period. And we can discuss what he omits. He omits any positive features of Buddhism, anything that Buddhism is adding to society, the flowering of poetry and the architecture that comes from Buddhism. That doesn't find its way into his passage at all. All right, so by 1200 then, we're looking at Confucianism as something of a state religion, and we're looking at China as if not the most centralized state in the world, then among the top two with the Byzantine Empire. So looking at that period right around 1200, we have the Sung dynasty in control. The map in the top middle shows that the Sung dynasty by 1200 had lost control of the northern part of China. It had lost control of northern China to groups that had imitated elements of Chinese culture and military power. And even still, the Sung dynasty that remained, what was known as the Southern Sung, was still wealthy and highly sophisticated for the time. So the Sung dynasty then is the time when, in the post-classical period, when the examination system was used to select about half of the bureaucrats. as a result, there is a new elite class that emerges. So the old nobility, the old noble families had lost status. They had lost influence within the government to these scholar gentry, to these people who had passed the exams. So the term scholar gentry generally refers to somebody of non-aristocratic background who had passed the exam, and if they passed enough of the exams and the exams at a high enough level, then they became the political elite of China, the mandarins. That group is going to dominate the top tier of the Chinese social system from this point until 1900, and we see that how that unravels down the line. So then Confucianism, which is the basis of the examination system, is very strong at this point. These scholars have a vested interest in maintaining Confucianism as a state philosophy, as something of a state religion. The Sung Dynasty is the period where China becomes highly commercialized. So there are many elements of the Sung Dynasty innovations in finance that we tend to associate with the Mongols. Things like paper money and the development of checks, because the Mongols use them much more widely. But it's at this point that paper money comes into use in China. So if we look at the bottom map on the left-hand side, the Grand Canal had been built at the beginning of the post-classical era, so right around 600, and connected the Yellow River in the north and the Yangtze in the south. So the two most politically important and the two of the economic centers in China. And so that meant that China had a vibrant internal economy. It was easy to get goods from where they were produced to where they were needed within China. And if you combine that with China's large population, then you can see how the Chinese became so much more focused on their own internal production and internal sales than on selling to other people. Still, by this time, the Silk Road had been in use for over 1,000 years. The Han Dynasty was the first of the Chinese dynasties to explicitly tax the Silk Road trade and to designate parts of what we call the Silk Road as areas that were under its influence. And so up until this time, there had been more of an informal flow of trade. So the Silk Road then involved a lot of Chinese goods like silk or porcelain, but was generally carried by people who were not Chinese. As the Chinese emphasis, again, is not on that kind of trade. It's on trade within China. But still, what this means is that people from far and wide found Chinese goods so valuable that they were willing to cross deserts and risk robbery in order to travel the Silk Road and get those goods. And so this encourages the Chinese to think once more in terms of focusing on the domestic economy. They don't need to go in search of goods. Other people will come to them. As a result of that trade, then what has happened is lots of different beliefs and ideas have reached China. And so one of these beliefs that had spread, as I said, during the Han period is Buddhism. And Buddhism caught on in its Mahayana form. The Mahayana form of Buddhism, which holds that there are a number of Buddhas and there are bodhisattvas, something like saints. These Buddhas and bodhisattvas can intervene on a practitioner's behalf and help them to basically shortcut the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path and achieve nirvana, which in this context becomes more like heaven, in one birth. That's what becomes popular. It's a good fit for the polytheistic practices within China. And so the version that becomes exceptionally popular among the peasants was Pure Land, which is the most salvationist version of the religion. And the peasants have rough lives, but at least they could hope that they would be saved and achieve nirvana. And so Buddhism is finding practitioners. Taoism was another religion that provided a spiritual element that Confucianism lacked. Taoism teaches people to go with the flow, be as natural as possible, don't try to structure your life unnaturally, follow the middle way. What happens by the Sung Dynasty is that a series of Confucian philosophers co-opt several Buddhist and Taoist doctrines, and that creates what we call Neo-Confucianism. Now, this was not done cynically. The Neo-Confucians would not have thought of themselves as inventing something new. What they instead argued is that these elements of Buddhism and Taoism that they were taking had always been part of Confucianism. And so what they are saying is that if you follow the Confucian set of relationships and the teachings of Confucius in the proper way, then it will end your suffering in the same way that Buddhists and Taoists argued that you could end your suffering. And so that form is a response to the challenge posed by those other religions. And so we see a similar development in Confucianism to the development we talked about in India with Hinduism, where there was a response to the challenge of Buddhism and then a response to the challenge of Islam. And so the kind of big picture at this point for China is that the wealth of China had enabled China to develop a highly centralized system. It had brought them into conflict into trade with groups as far away as the Abbasid Caliphate, and so they were exchanging ideas. Paper from China was reaching the Middle East, and algebra from the Middle East was reaching China. Medical ideas were reaching China, and so there's then this wealth in those areas that is going to paint a target on them, and so this is what's going to follow. So here we have one of the most famous travelers of all time, recounting his supposed visits to China. There are several such accounts from the late post-classical period. So it tells us that, broadly speaking, post-classical trade had made this, we don't want to say easy, but relatively easy. We don't see a lot of these accounts from much earlier than 1200. And then after 1200, we see the accounts of Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta most famously, as well as several other European emissaries of the Pope that reached China during this time. And so Marco Polo is telling us several different things. One, the Mongols who had taken over China were extremely wealthy. Their palace is evidence of that. Two, he tells us the level of sophistication is much greater in China than it was in Europe at this point, because he's not really sure what this black rock is that the Chinese are burning. Well, it's coal. And so the Chinese had figured out earlier than the Europeans one of the uses for coal. And so that tells us that the Chinese were mining coal at this point, and using it because it was superior to wood, even though they had wood. So when eventually the British, for instance, begin to burn coal in the same way, the main reason they did it is they were running out of wood, and not because they had come up with this idea. And so the third thing is he references the use of paper money. And he's you can see just how out of his depth he is in describing this. He's like, yes, the secret of alchemy. And kind of like magic that he can make this out of bark, this paper money. And so what we have here in terms of the sourcing then is Marco Polo contending he's a first-hand witness. He is, what enhances the credibility of this account is he's describing things we would find in other sources as well. It's corroborated, and like the use of coal. So if we're kind of looking at this in a more aggressive way, we might accuse him of, in order to sell books and get people to listen to him, maybe exaggerating that the walls of the palace are all covered with gold and silver, that sort of thing, in order to have an effect. Okay, so I'm going to kind of jump ahead to the Mongols taking over. So the Song, remember, weren't as militarily powerful as other Chinese dynasties, later dynasties like the Ming, or earlier dynasties like the Tang. Still, they were a tough nut to crack for the Mongols, and it takes the Mongols a while to conquer them. So let's go back and look at the beginning of the Mongol Empire. So on the map and on the right-hand side, you can see the city of Karakoram, which is right at the heart of the region where the Mongols came from. And when we talk about the Mongols, what we really are referring to are several pastoral groups in that part of Central Asia that had made a living raising horses and herding, but also made a living as societal predators, stealing wealth from civilized people. Because these groups were based on family connections, it was hard to unite them for any length of time. And this is where Genghis Khan comes in, or Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan, we don't have a lot of sources on Genghis Khan. The one source on his early life was written later, and it was definitely trying to build him up. And nevertheless, it kind of gives us some clues. What it tells us, and if this is true, it could be one of the reasons why he's able to form an empire, is that his father was poisoned when he was a child. When he eventually begins to make a name for himself as a result of that, he doesn't have family connections to employ to build up his empire, so instead he tends to promote people who are capable and loyal, and that is how he is able to go outside of that family structure. And he begins this process of conquering parts of China and sweeping into parts of the Middle East. So from the Chinese perspective, the more important figure is Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan conquers China, finally ends the Southern Song dynasty, and establishes a new Chinese dynasty, the Yuan dynasty. And so the Mongols under Kublai Khan are, on the one hand, appealing to a form of Chinese legitimacy. They're claiming to have inherited the mandate of heaven, and that this is the newest dynasty in the dynastic cycle, this Yuan dynasty. But on the other, Kublai Khan refuses to use the civil service exam to choose his highest level bureaucrats. Instead, he relies on Mongols and Persians at the highest level. And so this is what makes the scholarly gentry such implacable enemies of the Yuan dynasty. They're just looking for an opportunity. The base of Kublai Khan's support then wasn't the Chinese elite. It was, to a much larger degree, the Chinese peasants. The Yuan dynasty continued the Chinese practice, the practice set by earlier Chinese dynasties of redistributing land when they took power. This was often done by Chinese dynasties. The idea was the peasants are producers, and you could make them more productive by allowing them to farm on their own land than by having them farm on the estate of a large landholder. And so the difference is the Yuan go far beyond what earlier Chinese dynasties had done. This again would be offensive to the Chinese elite because they were the ones losing land as a result of this. So it's during this time that Silk Road trade is so well protected that we see a variety of accounts like that of Marco Polo. And so the Mongols had conquered an empire so quickly that they actually hadn't done very much to disrupt trade. And so on the contrary, it's at this point that the Silk Road reaches its peak in history. It becomes a rival to Indian Ocean trade, which had been the center of post-classical trade. And so the transmission of ideas and goods is going to be facilitated by the Mongol conquest. The transmission of disease inadvertently as well, the Black Death. So what happens to the Mongols is that they become soft, like many imperial rulers do. Kublai Khan and his successors become used to palace life. They no longer have that edge of being this pastoral people raised almost from birth to fight from horseback. And so the Ming dynasty arises as a result of this. And so the Ming, coming out of this period when China was ruled by foreigners, they are dead set on pushing the Mongols out and never being ruled by foreigners again. And so this is another one of those powerful dynasties militarily. But their emphasis as a result of China being conquered and ruled by the Mongols is going to be to ensure that China is safe, is secure. And so that is going to help explain some of the changes that occur as a consequence. The Ming fit within the pattern of the this late post-classical and early modern period, so 1450 into the 1500s and 1600s, of centralizing. So centralizing means this, that you're moving to the capital powers that had been exercised by people out in the provinces. And so China was already highly centralized. So what we're talking about here is that the civil service exam would be even more formalized than before, even more systematic than before, even used even more to recruit bureaucrats than in earlier dynasties. That does help to centralize control. But what we are referring to here in China, or if we were looking at the same centralization in Western Europe or in the Ottoman Empire, is to some degree or another trying to strip your established elites of privileges and powers they would have enjoyed in order to enhance the power of the monarch. And so in the Ming Dynasty, one example of this is that the scholar gentry were subject to physical punishments that they had been exempted from in earlier regimes. And so that this was meant as the threat of humiliation that could hang over the scholar gentry's head if they did anything that went against the wishes of the emperor. And so the emperor's power is enhanced, the scholar gentry's to some degree is diminished as a result of this. This type of system tends to work well if the emperor at the center of it all is pretty capable. If you have a series of bad emperors, it can unravel the centralized system that the Ming have put together. Maybe the biggest event of the late post-classical Ming is the sending out of Zheng He and his expeditions. So Zheng He was a Muslim. He had been in part of the territory captured by the Ming. He was a eunuch, so he had been castrated after he was captured. And so he is the kind of worldly Chinese figure who is the perfect fit for the expeditions that follow. So what the Chinese wanted to do is send out these expeditions in the Indian Ocean as a way of securing some of the materials that China needed and maybe expanding the tributary system. So the Zheng He expeditions illustrate that China had the technology, the wealth, the power, all the things you needed to sail across oceans. And they very well could have sent a ship across the Pacific and discovered the Americas, but they didn't. And so this is where we need to get into the mindset, because this can kind of challenge the views of China, especially when we begin to compare China to Japan or to Western Europe. So here's what happens. The Chinese, remember, are focused to a much greater degree on security against groups like the Mongols. And so they see this as a waste of money, sending out all these ships. What they would much rather do is build up the Great Wall, which is what they do during the Ming period. And two, it's unnecessary. Do you really need to do this? People are willing to cross the Silk Road in order to trade with China. So what's the point in spending money to send out these gigantic treasure ships under Zheng He? You don't need it. And they were right. This is what's going to follow. In 1495, Vasco da Gama is going to sail around Africa and reach India, and the Europeans were happy to sail around the entire globe in order to get to China and get Chinese goods. So why waste the money on this? And so on top of all that, remember, we have this Confucian ideology, which is very much inward looking. Look to Chinese tradition. Don't look to outside ideas. And so this variety of factors it leads to the end of these Zheng He expeditions. And so there's, in a way, a missed opportunity, because had the Chinese dominated the Indian Ocean, the Europeans would not have been able to do so. All right, so what we have here is one of the port cities, Canton, that the Europeans were allowed by the Chinese to trade in. Within the city of Canton, the foreign merchants had to stay in areas along the harbor called enclaves. We see that in this painting too. All the flags those are the foreign factories, they were called. A factory here doesn't mean like a manufacturing factory with machines. It means it's where the factor operated. Your factor was your trade representative. And so the trade businesses, the joint stock companies from Europe would operate in these factories. So the painting does a good job of showing growing European influence, but it also shows us that in 1785, the Europeans do not yet have the upper hand that they will have in the 19th century. You can see on the right the Chinese junk, which just dwarfs all the other ships in the harbor. And so these massive Chinese ships were, again, evidence of the technology and the wealth that they had. So in 1785, this is when Britain is just beginning to industrialize, these Chinese cities were still the richest in the world. There were places in Britain like London, one city, that might be considered wealthy, but otherwise Britain would just be no comparison to China in terms of wealth at that point. So we need to look at what happens, what gets us there, and it's a complex question. Historians really argue and debate over what it is that went down in China that caused China to go from being maybe the richest society in all the world to being on its knees at the mercy of the Europeans. So we enter this 1450 period. We still have the Ming in control, but they're going to fall into decline, and then we're going to have a group coming out of Manchuria. The Manchus establish a new dynasty, the Qing dynasty. So in 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. 1495, Vasco da Gama comes around Africa, and we begin to have these European interactions. And so this seems to confirm the Chinese worldview. These Europeans had some curiosities like clocks, but otherwise they didn't seem to be as sophisticated as the Chinese. Europeans at this point rarely bathed, and were otherwise seen as less than civilized by the Chinese. So there was some spread of Christianity to China, and you can see in the bottom right-hand corner a Jesuit approach to trying to spread Christianity in this period of time was to try to appeal to Confucians, dressing in the traditional way, and trying to fit in ancestor veneration to Christianity. And so who knows what might have happened had that caught on. It was shot down not by the Chinese, but by the Pope, who saw this as heresy. And so the European interactions then we can kind of picture like this. The Europeans were extracting huge amounts of silver from the Americas. And so in your mind, you should see a giant arrow going from the Americas to Europe. And then that arrow goes from Europe and it goes around Africa, and the arrow branches off into India and China. And so the Chinese then are in the driver's seat when it comes to trade. So the Europeans are willing to come around the world, buy Chinese goods using silver. The Europeans did not have much to offer otherwise. So still, we have that internal dynastic rot for the Ming. The last Ming emperor, the story goes, was so oblivious, so unaware of what was going on in the outside world, that there was an uprising against his empire that he didn't know was going on until it reached the gates of his palace. And then he decides, oh, it's over. He calls his family and he tries to kill them all. He chops off the arm of one daughter that manages to survive. And then he goes into his garden and he hangs himself from one of his favorite trees. And that's the end of the Ming Dynasty. And so this is what opens the door for the Manchu conquest. And the map in the bottom center shows what's going on here. The Manchuria is where the Sinified group comes from. They extend into the northern part of China. But just like was the case with the Sung, for a while the southern part of China remains held by the Ming and their supporters. And so it takes a while for the Manchus to consolidate control, but eventually they're going to create a gigantic land empire. And they're going to have employed gunpowder weapons to do so. So once again, if we're looking at the period right around 1700, then the Manchus look like one of the richest and most powerful societies in all of the world. So the Manchus establish a Chinese-style dynasty. So you have some strong parallels here to the Yuan, the Mongols. The Mongols were not Chinese. They came in, they conquered China, they established a Chinese dynasty. But there is some important differences as well. The Qing dynasty was far more traditionally Chinese than the Yuan dynasty. Kangxi, one of the early Qing emperors, was a Confucian scholar. The Qing continued to use the examination system to recruit bureaucrats, and were happy to use any Chinese bureaucrat that wanted to enter their service. Their problem was getting enough of them away from the Ming. However, they did subordinate the Chinese to Manchu rule. And so one of the visible ways of doing this was the queue. So the queue was the hairstyle you see in the bottom left picture. So we go from the Ming top knot to the shaved front head with the long hair in the back. And so this was something that all of the Chinese scholar gentry, all the Chinese aristocrats were compelled to do by the Qing government. And so it's like having people wear their subordination to you. And in much the same way that Peter the Great of Russia required his nobles to shave their beards and to dress in a Western fashion. And so this goes along with several other policies, like the use of bannermen as kind of a way of organizing the military by requiring people to swear oaths of loyalty to the Manchu, of subordinating the Chinese and introducing Manchu institutions to China. Beyond that, the Manchu attempt to strongly regulate European interactions in China. And so they require the Europeans to trade only in two ports, Macau and Canton. They had to stay in those enclaves. They had to trade with licensed Chinese merchants. And so you would think that these insulting policies might have caused trade to be reduced. But very much the opposite occurs. More and more Europeans are showing up. And as the Europeans industrialize and as they develop more efficient ways of organizing their military, they're going to look for ways to undermine this regulation, because the European thinking is that if they can just get into the interior of China, they will be able to unlock this market for European goods. The Chinese mentality under the Qing is that they don't want this awful European culture spreading to China, the Middle Kingdom. Here is where we are headed, and this is a depiction by a Japanese artist, and the depiction is a form of propaganda in that the Japanese very much like to present themselves as modern, and they like to present the Chinese as backward. And that's exactly what they're doing in this painting, and so the Japanese had shocked the world, and definitely shocked China, when they had used their newly built fleet to defeat the Chinese in 1895. And so this was a reversal of the traditional relationship. Japan had been a tributary state at one time to China. And so it is the one of several humiliations that kind of end the Qing dynasty. So that's where we're headed. And so let's look at what happens in the late Manchu dynasty and then the modernization efforts and failures that follow. So by the time we get to 1800, the Manchu dynasty in China is in decline. This is that traditional dynastic decline. They're doing things like failing to keep flood walls up and failing to dredge out the Grand Canal. And so already decentralization in the provinces is on the rise, corruption's on the rise. And so there's this what if, historians like to ask, what if the Manchu had not been in the process of dynastic decline, but instead had been on the rise when the Europeans had reached their industrialized peak? Because we have a parallel with Japan. Japan's Tokugawa shogunate, Japan's imperial system, was not in decline when the Europeans showed up, and Japan was able to effectively modernize, and China doesn't. And so the prevailing view among historians now is that the Manchu dynastic decline was the most significant factor in China's failure to industrialize. So by 1800, China has fallen behind. And there is even more trouble. What has happened is that the Europeans, the British, have discovered a particularly strong strain of opium in India. And opium was a popular drug at the time. There are stories in India of one of the Indian princes who was so high on opium that he couldn't even hold his head up when he was trying to enter a battle, and they had to take him to his tent to rest. And then there are all kinds of stories of romantic poets in Europe who claimed that by getting high on opium, by eating opium, they unlocked their creative potential, and their poetic masterpieces were a product of that. And so what occurs in China is that the drug is smuggled into China, and you have this wealthy scholar gentry class that is, as a result of dynastic decline, not as busy as before. So they're bored but wealthy, and so they become one of several groups of people that we would see over history up till today using what were considered high-class drugs. And so the Chinese oppose this. So you can see the bottom center picture of the Chinese official smoking opium. Obviously, the Chinese government doesn't want that. They oppose it. Eventually, they appoint an upstanding official, Lin Zexu, to stop the smuggling of opium. Lin Zexu seizes an opium shipment and smashes the barrels open so that the opium runs into the harbor. And that sets off the Opium Wars. And so the Opium Wars, the first one in 1839, won by the British. Now, Britain hadn't fully industrialized yet. So Britain doesn't win this war because of industrialization as much as because the Europeans, in fighting each other so often, had developed better ways of building fighting vessels. European ships that engaged in naval warfare were far more maneuverable and had much more firepower than Chinese ships. They tended to be built of harder wood, so they were more difficult to penetrate than Chinese ships were. And so the British fleet sails all the way around the world, defeats China in their own backyard, forces the Chinese to sign the first of the unequal treaties. So the unequal treaties begin the process of dividing China into spheres of influence. So if you look at the map on the bottom to the right, it shows the different spheres of influence that China has been carved into by the late 19th century. So in those areas, what we would see is a lot of economic imperialism. The British, when they forced the Chinese to sign the Treaty of Nanjing, the unequal treaty that ended the Opium Wars, they required the Chinese to exempt them from a number of import taxes. So it becomes cheaper to sell goods to China. They forced the Chinese to allow British merchants into more and more of the country. And so the British increasingly are going to control things like steamship operations and railway lines, which give them a lot of political influence. So they don't need to create a colony in Japan or in China where they're ruling directly. They can use the weakness of the Qing dynasty in order to control the areas they want to control. So this weakness of the Qing dynasty, its corruption, its failure to govern correctly, is going to lead to a traditional, in many ways traditional, Chinese peasant uprising, and that's the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion is started by a failed civil service examination taker. He takes the exam, fails it, takes it again, fails it, has something of a nervous breakdown. Having come into contact with European missionaries, he imagines himself to be the younger brother of Jesus. And on the map, on the bottom left, it shows the success of the Taiping in spreading. Now, the Taiping Rebellion fails after about 15 years, and part of the reason it fails is that the Europeans prop up the Qing dynasty. So what occurs as a result of the Opium Wars and then the Taiping Rebellion, these close calls, is that finally the Chinese really begin to try to modernize. And so this is known as the self-strengthening movement. The self-strengthening movement focused above all on military reforms and building up a modern navy and building up a modern army. But like other similar movements that fail to reform more fundamentally, it's going to be unsuccessful. So really what you need to do to modernize is to change the school system entirely. You need to have a modern style school system where you're teaching people math, science, and the rest of it. And if you don't do that, then how can you have the factories to support the military in order to have the strength you're looking for? You can't. And so the Chinese are one of these societies that is trying to get away with shortcutting this. They want the military power without the other changes to their institutions. And we can see why they would be reluctant to make the changes that were needed. If you change the education system, that means dismantling the civil service exam, which is likely to antagonize the scholar gentry. And if you antagonize them too much, then the Qing dynasty could fall. It almost fell. It almost fell with the Taiping Rebellion. So it's not like this is out of the question. And so this is what we see in society after society after society. It's not that the Chinese are stupid. It's that the Chinese rulers make a choice. They would rather, for the short term, maintain control at the expense of the modernizing that China needs over the long haul. And so we see the Empress Dowager in the bottom right, who is the most notorious of these self-strengtheners. And so the Empress Dowager talked a good game about modernizing and definitely understood some of the things that China needed to do, but didn't push any meaningful change. So what that European control is going to lead to is a nationalist movement in China that culminates with the Boxer Rebellion. So right around 1900, we have this group in the top middle, the Boxers. The Boxers were martial artists who had developed a new view of martial arts, that if you practice martial arts in just the right way, you would channel the Tao and you would become invulnerable to bullets. And so this was a very difficult thing to disprove, by the way, because if somebody shot you and killed you and you were a boxer, then people would just say, oh, he's not practicing it in the right way. And so the Boxers are one of the first of the rebels against the Europeans in this period. And we have a lot of European accounts of the Boxers going into their martial arts moves as they encounter Europeans. And the Europeans, remember, have really no knowledge of what's going on. It was often described as a type of dance that the Boxers were doing. Well, what happens here is that what was a local uprising becomes a national uprising. Nationalism is inflamed across China, and the Qing dynasty decides to roll the dice and back the Boxers. And so the combination of the irregular Boxer forces and the regular army could have driven the Western powers out, could have the United States and Japan as well, had they been used appropriately. So in other words, if self-strengthening had been effective, then the Boxer Rebellion could have made it very difficult for the foreign countries to maintain a toehold in China. But self-strengthening had not been effective. So one example of this is that the Chinese army had rifles. They had modern rifles. And rifles work like this. You have to change the sighting if you're going to use them for long distance. So you in order to aim them properly, you have to account for gravity. So if you're firing at a target that's 900 meters away, you have to basically tilt the rifle barrel up a little bit to account for gravity. So when you sight it up, then you are sighting it up so that you can fire at something far away. If you sight it down, you're trying to fire at something at closer range. Well, the Chinese soldiers didn't know this. They thought if you sight it up, in other words, if you're trying to fire over long distance, then that must cause the bullet to come out of the barrel with greater force. So you would always want to do that, right? And as a result, we have account after account after account that describes how the Chinese soldiers fired over the heads of the Europeans. So while they had the military hardware necessary to win battles against the Europeans during the Boxer Rebellion, they didn't have the training or the reorganization of the military that would have made those weapons more effective. And so self-strengthening was a failure. And as a result, the Boxer Rebellion was a failure. The resistance falls apart. The Qing dynasty, consequently, is completely discredited. And in 1905, the civil service examination is dismantled, and then in 1910, the Qing dynasty is overthrown and a republic is declared. But this is going to begin decades of turmoil for China. And what follows this period of instability and a lack of modernization is going to be the type of poverty that will make it difficult to establish a stable republic. So you'll have warlords fighting for power. You'll have Chiang Kai-shek versus the communists, the Civil War. Then Mao Zedong takes power and has several of his supposedly visionary plans for ending poverty that will, in the short term, make things worse. Until finally you get to the death of Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping as the chairman of the Communist Party. And he's going to institute these capitalist reforms that will jumpstart the Chinese economy. And so what we have today is a one-party rule, dictatorial rule, similar in a lot of ways to what we would see in the Manchu period, but having addressed a lot of these problems with modernization that went unaddressed in the late 19th century. And so the Communist Party has only to remind people of the instability of the previous century in order to maintain control. This has been the secret to its success so far. Do you want to go back to the Great Leap Forward? Do you want to go back to the Chinese Civil War? Do you want to go back to the Manchu period? No, nobody wants to. So what we're leaving, or very few people would, what we're leaving here is China at the low point. China, once the wealthiest and most sophisticated of the societies, or at least one of them, is now a failed society, a society that can't adequately deal with population growth and the issues of modernization.